Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Aaron had always had a sharp instinct. At 38, working as a software engineer at a tech company, he'd learned to trust patterns, those subtle, almost invisible signs others overlooked. That same instinct had made him excellent at his job, able to spot complex bugs before they caused serious problems. But it was also that instinct that his wife Melissa called paranoia. Melissa, 36, a marketing consultant with a brilliant career and a magnetic personality, had a gift for making Aaron question his own perception. When he mentioned that she seemed distant, she'd roll her eyes and sigh. When he asked about the messages she quickly hid, she accused him of being controlling. When he brought up her increasingly frequent client outings, she'd explode, claiming he was sabotaging her success out of insecurity. For months, Aaron tried to ignore the signs, the deleted texts, the inconsistent schedules, the unfamiliar perfume he sometimes caught on her when she came home, the way she avoided eye contact whenever he tried talking about their future. But his gut kept screaming, a persistent voice that refused to be silenced. It was Melissa who suggested couples therapy. She came home one Thursday night after yet another of those meetings that ran late and announced she'd found the perfect therapist. Dr. Bennett, she explained, was highly recommended and specialized in trust and jealousy issues in relationships. Aaron felt a tightening in his chest as he listened, noticing how she framed the problem, making it clear who she saw as the issue in their marriage. But he agreed. If there was any chance of saving what they'd built over 7 years together, he was willing to try. The first session was revealing in ways Aaron hadn't expected. Dr. Bennett, a man in his 50s with gray hair and a soft voice, seemed to have already formed an opinion before even getting to know him. His questions were pointed, always putting Aaron on the defensive. Why did he feel threatened by Melissa's success? Where did this need to control her movements come from? Had he ever considered that his own behavior might be sabotaging the relationship? Melissa sat beside him on the beige couch in the therapist's office, wearing the perfectly calibrated look of a patient victim. She spoke in a trembling voice about how hard it was to deal with Aaron's constant accusations, how suffocated she felt by his suspicion. Dr. Bennett nodded sympathetically, jotting notes in his brown leather notebook. Aaron tried to explain his feelings and the concrete reasons for his concerns, but his words were skillfully redirected. The therapist turned every example Aaron offered into evidence of his possessiveness. When Aaron mentioned that Melissa had recently started using more complicated passwords for her phone, Dr. Bennett asked why he felt entitled to access her personal device. When he talked about her irregular hours, the therapist suggested Aaron was projecting his own insecurities onto Melissa's legitimate professional commitments. The session settled into a predictable pattern. Melissa expressed her frustrations with strategically placed tears. Dr. Bennett validated every complaint. Aaron walked out of each session feeling smaller, questioning his own sanity. Maybe he really was the problem. Maybe his instincts were failing him for the first time in his life. But then Melissa started having individual sessions with Dr. Bennett. She explained that the therapist had suggested it so she could process her emotions more clearly without Aaron's presence, which, according to Bennett, inhibited her. Aaron agreed, hoping it would help, hoping it might somehow bring them closer again. It was during one of those weeks of separate sessions that Aaron was organizing Melissa's work bag, looking for the car keys she'd asked him to grab. He found a small voice recorder she occasionally used for important meetings. The device was turned off, forgotten at the bottom of her bag among business cards and promotional pens. And that's when Aaron's instinct roared louder than ever. An idea began forming in his mind, an idea his old self would have instantly dismissed as excessive paranoia. But this new version of him, shaped by months of gaslighting and manipulation, was ready to trust that instinct one last time. The night before Melissa's next individual session, Aaron took the recorder. He checked the battery, confirmed it was working perfectly, and switched it to voice activation mode. Then, hands trembling slightly, he tucked it into the side compartment of Melissa's bag, nestled between a notebook and a document folder. It was a risk. If she found it, it would be yet more evidence of his so-called paranoia. But something inside him said he had to do it. Melissa left for her session on Tuesday afternoon wearing that navy blue blazer Aaron had always loved on her. She kissed his cheek distractedly before heading out, as if it were just another ordinary day. Aaron spent the next 2 hours in agony, alternating between regret for having planted the recorder and terror over what he might uncover. When Melissa returned, she seemed light, almost relieved. She mentioned the session had been productive, that Dr. Bennett was helping her process a lot. Then she went upstairs to shower, leaving her bag by the front door, as she always did. Aaron waited until he heard the shower running. Then, heart pounding violently in his chest, he grabbed the recorder from the bag and went up to his office. He plugged in headphones, sat down in his leather chair, which creaked under his weight, and pressed play. The first few minutes were ambient sounds, rustling from the bag, footsteps, a door closing. Then came Melissa's voice, clear and lacking the victim tone she used in joint sessions. "Thanks for seeing me alone again, Ben. These sessions have been such a relief." Dr. Bennett's voice, equally relaxed, nothing like the professional formality he used during joint appointments. "No problem, Mel. How's it going with Ryan?" Aaron froze. Ryan. His best friend since college. Ryan, who'd been his best man. Ryan, who came over for dinner every Sunday. Ryan, who he'd considered a brother. Melissa's voice continued, now warm in a way Aaron recognized, but hadn't heard directed at him in months. "It's been incredible, Ben. I never imagined it would be this intense. Ryan makes me feel things I'd forgotten were even possible." "And Aaron still hasn't picked up on anything specific?" Melissa laughed, a genuine, light laugh. "He suspects everything, but he's got no real proof. It's funny, you know. He's right to be suspicious, but these sessions with you are making him look like the crazy one. If we end up divorcing, I'm sure I can use all this to my advantage." "Speaking of that," Dr. Bennett's voice turned more practical, "have you started transferring assets like we discussed? Accounts in your name, investments he doesn't closely monitor?" "I've started. I opened that account you suggested and have been moving small amounts over. Nothing that'll trigger immediate alerts. And Ryan helped me better understand some of the properties that are solely in my name." "Perfect. Keep documenting Aaron's behavior over the next few weeks, every accusation, every jealous moment. It'll be useful when you need to establish a pattern of controlling behavior. Do you really think I'll get the majority in the settlement? With the right documentation and my clinical records about his behavior?" "Absolutely. He's building his own case against himself every time he walks in here." There was more, much more. Melissa went into detail about hotel meetings with Ryan while Aaron thought she was with clients. She described how the affair had started nearly a year ago during a business trip Aaron couldn't attend. She revealed that Ryan was also in the process of divorcing and that they planned to build a future together as soon as they could clean up their current marriages. Dr. Bennett wasn't just an incompetent therapist. He was an active accomplice. He gave advice on how Melissa could maximize her financial gain in the divorce, how to use therapy sessions as evidence of Aaron's emotional instability, and how to document behaviors that could be interpreted as abusive in a legal context. When the recording ended, Aaron sat in silence. There were no tears. No explosive anger. Just cold, absolute clarity. His instinct had been right all along. He wasn't paranoid. He was being systematically betrayed and manipulated by his wife, his best friend, and an unethical therapist who was violating every rule of his profession. Aaron made copies of the recording, 3 copies on different devices, one securely backed up in the cloud with triple redundancy. Then he started doing his homework. He researched divorce attorneys, read up on litigation fraud, studied the state's psychological licensing board regulations. He worked through the entire night while Melissa slept peacefully in the next room, unaware that her carefully constructed facade was about to collapse. The next morning, Aaron called one of the most aggressive divorce attorneys in the area. Marcus Webb had a reputation for being ruthless in contentious divorce cases. During the consultation, Aaron played the recording. The smile that formed on Webb's face was predatory. "This is gold," Webb said, leaning back in his leather chair. "Not only do you have clear evidence of adultery, but also conspiracy to defraud you in a divorce and serious professional misconduct. That Dr. Bennett is about to lose his license. As for your wife, well, she just handed us the perfect case." "And Ryan?" Aaron asked, his voice surprisingly calm. "The affair partner always suffers social consequences. But let's make sure he's not the only one who pays. We'll handle this the right way." The next few days were a mix of strategic planning and Oscar-worthy acting. Aaron kept attending therapy sessions, allowing Dr. Bennett to keep painting him as the problematic husband. Melissa relaxed even further, convinced her plan was working perfectly. She grew bolder, coming home later and being less careful with her lies. Aaron documented everything, every inconsistency in her stories, every mismatched time stamp, every suspicious expense. He legally accessed bank records, copied statements, photographed receipts. He built a complete, meticulous, irrefutable dossier. Then he waited for the perfect moment. Their next couples therapy session was scheduled for Thursday afternoon. But Aaron had other plans for that day. He arrived at Dr. Bennett's office 15 minutes early. Melissa hadn't shown up yet, as had become her recent habit. Aaron entered the waiting room and told the receptionist he'd wait. But he wasn't alone. Webb was parked outside. And Aaron had made one other crucial call, to Jennifer, Ryan's wife. When Melissa arrived, she found Aaron already seated in the therapy room, but the atmosphere felt different. There was a tension in the air she couldn't place. Dr. Bennett also seemed slightly uneasy, though he tried to maintain his professional mask. "Aaron got here early," Bennett said, trying to sound casual. "Shall we start?" "Actually," Aaron said, his voice calm but charged with something that made Melissa stiffen, "I'd like to run today's session a little differently." He pulled a small Bluetooth speaker from his backpack and placed it on the glass coffee table between them. Melissa frowned in confusion. Dr. Bennett kept a neutral expression, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of concern. "You know, Melissa," Aaron began, looking directly at his wife, "you're right about one thing. I am paranoid. I suspect everything. And I've recently realized that this instinct, that paranoia, as you call it, is actually my greatest gift." "Aaron, what are you talking about?" Melissa's voice carried that practiced, performative frustration she wielded so well. "I'm talking about this." He pressed play on the speaker. Melissa's voice filled the room. "Thanks for seeing me alone again, Ben. These sessions have been such a relief." The color drained from Melissa's face. Dr. Bennett abruptly rose from his chair, but Aaron raised a hand. "Sit down, Doctor. You'll want to hear this. In fact, the State Ethics Board will want to hear it too." The next few minutes were devastating. The recording played relentlessly, revealing every sordid detail of the affair, the conspiracy, the manipulation. Melissa's voice describing intimate moments with Ryan. Bennett advising how to maximize divorce gains. The entire scheme laid bare in crystal-clear audio. Melissa started to cry, but these weren't the strategic tears from previous sessions. They were tears of pure panic. "Aaron, I can explain, this isn't what it looks like." "Not what it looks like?" Aaron laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. "It's exactly what it looks like, Melissa. It's you and my best friend not only betraying our marriage but actively conspiring with an unethical professional to destroy me financially and emotionally." Dr. Bennett tried to regain control. "Aaron, that recording was made without consent, that's perfectly legal in this state," Aaron interrupted. "We live in a one-party consent state." Melissa was carrying the recorder. She consented, even if unintentionally. More importantly, as a licensed professional, you engaged in serious misconduct that victimized a client. That overrides any privacy concerns. Melissa stood up, her bag shaking in her hands. I'm leaving. I don't have to listen to this. Sit down. Aaron's voice cut through the air like a whip, a tone she'd never heard from him before. You haven't heard the best part yet. He pulled out another device, his tablet, and turned the screen so both could see. On it was a string of emails between him and the state's Professional Ethics Board. Attached were the full transcript of the recording, documentation of all therapy sessions, bank statements showing Melissa's transfers, and a complete legal affidavit. I've already sent all of this to the appropriate authorities, Aaron said. Dr. Bennett, you're about to face a full investigation for professional misconduct, ethics violations, and potentially criminal charges for conspiracy to commit fraud. Your career is over. Bennett turned pale, sweat forming on his forehead. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words came out. Aaron rotated the tablet to show another screen. And as for you, Melissa, I've also sent copies to your HR department, since you initiated and maintained a relationship with Ryan, who is married and works for a client company, clearly violating corporate ethics policy. And speaking of Ryan. At that moment, the door to the waiting room opened. Jennifer, Ryan's wife, walked in, her expression shifting between shock and cold fury. She'd been listening through the office's thin wall. So it's true, she said, her voice trembling. I didn't want to believe it when Aaron called me yesterday, but it's true. Melissa shrank into the couch, her composure completely shattered. Jennifer, Don't talk to me, Jennifer cut in, her voice sharp. Don't say a single word to me. You and my husband, you've destroyed 2 families. Why? For a thrill? For pure selfishness? Aaron watched the scene with grim satisfaction. There was no real pleasure in it, but there was a sense of justice being served. He stood, picked up his backpack, and looked at Melissa one last time. For months you called me paranoid, he said, his voice low but clear. You made me question my own sanity. You used my love for you as a weapon against me. But in the end, my instinct was right. Every suspicion, every moment of doubt, it was all justified. You weren't the victim in this relationship, Melissa. You were the villain. He walked to the door, pausing only to look at Dr. Bennett. I hope it was worth it, Doctor. I hope whatever she paid or promised you was worth your license and your reputation. Aaron left the office, Jennifer right behind him. They met Marcus Webb in the parking lot, who wore a satisfied smile. That went better than I imagined, Webb said. Now for the real legal work. We'll file the papers tomorrow. With this evidence, this will be one of the most one-sided divorces I've ever handled. The following weeks were a whirlwind of legal proceedings. The recording became evidence in multiple actions. The State Ethics Board opened a formal investigation into Dr. Bennett. Within a month, his license was suspended. Within 3, that suspension became permanent revocation. He'd never practice therapy again. Melissa's HR department launched its own investigation. The relationship with Ryan, clearly violating policies on relationships with employees of client companies, led to her termination. Her reputation in the industry was tarnished. Clients she'd cultivated for years suddenly became unavailable. Ryan faced similar consequences. Jennifer immediately filed for divorce, and with the affair evidence, she secured primary custody of their kids and a highly favorable asset division. His company also took disciplinary action, especially once it became clear he'd used corporate resources to facilitate the affair. Aaron and Melissa's divorce was surprisingly swift given the circumstances. With evidence of adultery and attempted financial fraud, Melissa had little ground to contest. Aaron kept the house, most joint assets, and emerged financially far better off than he would have been had Melissa's plan succeeded. But what mattered most to Aaron was validation. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't paranoid. His instinct, that inner voice that screamed something was wrong, had been absolutely right. For months he'd been manipulated into doubting his own perception, but in the end, that same sharp perception saved him. 6 months after the confrontation, Aaron was in his new apartment, a spacious place with a river view he'd chosen specifically because it was nothing like the home he'd shared with Melissa. He was organizing his home office when the phone rang. It was Jennifer. "Hey," she said, her voice lighter than he'd heard it in months. "I just wanted to thank you again. I know this was hard for you too, but you saved me from years of lies." "We saved each other," Aaron replied. "How are you holding up?" "Better. The kids are adjusting. Ryan's being Ryan. Trying to downplay everything, painting himself as the victim. But things are getting better." They chatted a few more minutes before hanging up. Aaron returned to arranging books on his new shelf, reflecting on how dramatically life could change in just a few months. He thought about Melissa, where she was now. He'd heard through the grapevine she was living with a friend and struggling to find work in her field. Ryan was also floundering, his industry reputation permanently damaged. They were still together, apparently, bound by the disaster they'd created. Aaron found he felt no pity. They'd made choices, deliberate, cruel choices. They'd conspired not just to cheat, but to destroy. And in the end, it was their own actions that came back to haunt them. As for Dr. Bennett, Aaron occasionally checked the case status. The investigation had uncovered a history of questionable behavior. Melissa wasn't the first client he'd conspired with in inappropriate ways. There were other victims, other couples he'd manipulated. The license revocation was just the beginning. Civil lawsuits were piling up. One night, several weeks later, Aaron was dining at an Italian restaurant he used to frequent with Melissa. He'd avoided the place for months but decided it was time to reclaim spaces meaningful to him. He was savoring a plate of carbonara when he saw Melissa walk in with Ryan. They didn't notice him at first. Melissa looked tired, somehow older. Her hair, always impeccably styled, was pulled into a messy ponytail. Ryan looked tense, his shoulders rigid with stress. They were seated near the exit, not the preferred section where Aaron sat. Ryan spotted him first. His eyes widened, and he touched Melissa's arm. She followed his gaze and froze when she saw Aaron. For a moment, the three of them were locked in a strange tableau, the weight of years of history and betrayal hanging heavily in the air. Aaron didn't look away. He simply gave a slight nod, a minimal acknowledgement that he'd seen them. Then he returned his focus to his meal. He wasn't being rude. He just had nothing left to say to them. That chapter was closed. Melissa and Ryan hurriedly took their seats, clearly uncomfortable. They stayed less than half an hour before leaving, their food nearly untouched. Aaron glanced up as they got up to go. Melissa looked his way one last time, something like regret flickering across her face. But Aaron had already turned back to the book he was reading, completely disinterested. When he finally left the restaurant, the night was clear and mild. Aaron walked to his car, feeling lighter than he had in years. The constant sense that something was wrong, the tension in his shoulders he'd carried for so long, was finally gone. His instinct was at peace, validated and reliable once more. As he drove home, he thought about the future. There was a coworker, Laura, who'd shown interest in maybe grabbing coffee sometime. Aaron had been hesitant, still processing the trauma of what Melissa had done. But maybe it was time to start considering that possibility. There was no rush. He had time to rebuild, to learn to trust again. And this time, he promised himself, he'd never ignore that instinct, not when it was whispering concern, and certainly not when it was shouting alarm. Because in the end, that instinct Melissa had tried to destroy, that paranoia she'd used against him, was exactly what had saved him. Aaron pulled into his parking spot and looked up at his apartment building. It wasn't the dream home he'd imagined when he married Melissa. But it was his, earned honestly, free of lies and manipulation. And that, he realized, was worth more than any fantasy of a perfect marriage. As he walked upstairs, Aaron thought about that little recorder, that insignificant device that had changed everything. He remembered the moment he decided to hide it in Melissa's bag, how his hands had trembled with the audacity of it. He thought about the courage it took to press play and listen to the truth. And he smiled. Because in the end, it wasn't paranoia. It was survival. It was instinct. It was refusing to let gaslighting erode his grip on reality. And that refusal, that stubborn trust in himself despite everything, was what finally set him free. Life after Melissa wasn't perfect. There were lonely nights, moments of doubt, flashes of anger over lost time. But there was also peace. Clarity. The deep satisfaction of knowing he'd faced betrayal not with violence or destruction, but with intelligence, strategy, and justice. And perhaps most importantly, there was renewed certainty that he could trust himself. His instinct wasn't his enemy. It was his most reliable ally. And anyone who ever tried to make him question that again would be immediately removed from his life. Aaron entered his apartment, dropped his keys in the bowl by the door, and headed straight to the kitchen to make tea. As he waited for the water to boil, he looked out the window at the city lights below. Somewhere out there, Melissa was dealing with the consequences of her choices. Dr. Bennett was facing the collapse of his career. Ryan was navigating the wreckage of his life. But here, in this apartment that smelled of new books and fresh possibilities, Aaron was finally home. At peace. And completely, unquestionably, justifiably confident in his own instinct. Because sometimes, paranoia isn't paranoia. Sometimes, it's just the truth waiting to be uncovered. And Aaron had had the courage to seek it, even when everyone around him said he was wrong. That courage, that self-trust, was his greatest victory. And that, Aaron realized as he sipped his tea and settled in for a quiet night, was the real win. Not Melissa's downfall or Bennett's disgrace, but the recovery of his own inner voice, his own truth. And no one could ever take that from him again. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.